Welcome to my channel. The Fifth Crusade. The Children's Crusade demonstrated that Europeans remained dedicated to retaking Jerusalem and saving the true cross despite numerous setbacks. Innocent III started making preparations for a second voyage to the east almost soon after the Fourth Crusade. Innocent was prepared to rally the soldiers of Christendom to battle for the restoration of Western rule in the Holy Land by 1213, despite being held up by disputes over the imperial succession and associated issues. After learning from the Fourth Crusade's errors, Innocent resolved that the Church would oversee the new attempt at every stage. He appointed a brand new group of Crusade preachers, who were deliberately sent out after receiving specific training to recruit soldiers. Additionally, Innocent dispatched delegates to manage the recruiting and preparations. By February 1219, the Muslims were seriously alarmed and offered peace terms that included the cession of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, including the Holy City, as well as the return of the true cross. King John and many of the Crusaders were eager to accept, but Pelagius, supported by the military orders and the Italians, refused. Damietta was finally taken on November 5, 1219, and for more than a year no further progress was made. Pelagius remained optimistic, still expecting the arrival of Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who had promised to go on crusade in 1215, and convinced of the imminent approach of a legendary Asian Christian, King David. The Fifth Crusade was always on the verge of triumph but ultimately failed due to a split in the leadership and Pelagius's frequent poor judgment. If Frederick II had followed through on his promises, it might have been successful. It is notable because Pelagius wasn't the only person to blame. The emperor and the pope were also held responsible. Overall, it was a dull incident that was only made bearable by Francis of Assisi's presence. Pelagius reluctantly allowed him to cross the border, where he was politely met by al-Malik al-Kamil. Francis made a sincere appeal to the Muslim leader to accept Christianity, but the leader refused. The Crusade of Frederick II. Frederick II bore a great deal of responsibility for the Fifth Crusade's failure, despite the difficulty in evaluating his crusader intentions. He is a divisive person who has been called both the greatest emperor and the archenemy of the popes. Islam was one of his intellectual interests, and he had a mindset that might have been more akin to an Eastern lord than a normal Western crusader. He gained a claim to the throne by his marriage to Isabella, Yolande, the daughter of John of Brienne, and later, after Isabella's passing in 1228, to the regency of Jerusalem, Acre. After being allowed several postponements by the Pope to settle affairs in the empire, Frederick finally agreed to terms that virtually placed his expedition under papal jurisdiction. Yet his entire Eastern policy was inextricably connected with his European concerns: Sicily, Italy and the papacy, and Germany. Cyprus Jerusalem became, as a consequence, part of a greater imperial design. John of Ibelin, the prominent member of the powerful Ibelin family, had been appointed as the young Henry I's regent in Cyprus. He was prepared, like the majority of the barons, to acknowledge the emperor's suzerainty over Cyprus. However, because Acre had received word of Isabella's passing, the emperor could only assert a regency there for his little son. John complied with the emperor's request that they meet in Cyprus, but despite threats, he refused to cede control of Beirut and requested that his case be heard by the High Court of Barons. Frederick departed for Acre once the issue was put on hold. The barons were successful in Cyprus, and in 1233 Henry I was recognized as king. Even after John of Ibelin, the old lord of Beirut, died in 1236, resistance continued. In 1243 a parliament at Acre refused homage to Frederick's son, Conrad, unless he appeared in person, and named Alice, Queen Dowager of Cyprus, regent. As a result, in the Levant, baronial government prevailed over imperial power. However, the barons' triumph did not end the kingdom's divide. Rather, it further exacerbated it as new forces emerged in the Muslim world. By being driven south and west by the Mongols, the Khwarezmian Turks upended the balance of power and won Egypt's backing. When the 10-year period of peace ended in 1239, the Muslims quickly retook the helpless city of Jerusalem. Under the leadership of Thibaut IV of Champagne and Richard of Cornwall, the Crusades of 1239 to 1241 successfully negotiated the restitution of the city and other exiled lands. The Crusades of St. Louis. Pope Innocent IV convened the first meeting of the Great Ecclesiastical Council at Lyons in June 1245, a year after the final surrender of Jerusalem. Even though the East had made urgent pleas for assistance, It is unlikely that the Pope's thoughts were primarily on the crusade given the variety of crises the Church was facing, including numerous reports of clergy abuse, growing conflict with Frederick II in Italy, and the Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe. However, the Pope supported it and approved the customary tax on clerical incomes when King Louis IX of France declared his intention to lead a new crusade. As a crusader, Louis, who would be canonized in 1297, was the antithesis of Frederick. Possessed of a rare combination of religious devotion, firmness as a ruler, and bravery as a warrior, he seemed the very ideal of the crusader. He was beloved by his subjects and respected abroad. He ardently believed the crusade to be God's work, and he was far from sympathetic to the Pope's use of crusade propaganda against the emperor. The ancient Abbasid Caliphate came to an end during these same years when a force of Mongols led by Hulagu invaded Mesopotamia and captured Baghdad in 1258. The Mongols were routed at Ain Jalt in Syria in 1260 by the Mamluks of Egypt, a new dynasty that had developed from the rulers of the Sultan's former slave bodyguards. This victory put an end to the Mongols' southerly expansion. The Latin powers were in great peril, and the Muslim states of Syria were trapped in the midst. Bohemond I of Antioch, Tripoli, and King Hayton of Armenia joined forces with the Mongols. However, the barons of Acre were still more inclined to negotiate with the Muslims, who they were familiar with, rather than the dreadful and mysterious Mongols. In July 1270, Louis' new crusade set sail from southern France. Disease attacked the army soon after the French arrived in North Africa, killing both Louis and his son John Tristan. In order to negotiate for an indemnity to evacuate the remaining soldiers, Charles landed with the Sicilian fleet in time. As a result, the crusade was tragically unsuccessful and did not benefit the East. Nevertheless, Louis IX rose to become the archetype of the devoted soldier of Christ for all Christians despite his two missteps. Europeans continued to support the Crusades and to hope for their success even though the rise of Muslim dominance looked to be inexorable. In 1260, after murdering his predecessor, Baybars became Sultan of Egypt. Though this famous Mamluk Sultan did not live to see the fall of the Latin states, he died in 1277, he had reduced them to a few coastal outposts. Baybars was ruthless, utterly lacking the generous chivalry that the Crusaders had admired in Saladin. Most of his conquests were followed by a general massacre of the inhabitants, often including the native Christians, especially when they had been in league with the Mongols. In 1265 he took Caesarea, Haifa, and Arsuf. The following year he conquered Galilee and devastated Cilicia and Armenia. In 1268 Antioch was taken and all the inhabitants slaughtered. The great Hospitaller fortress of Crac des Chevaliers fell 3 years later. These disasters again brought pleas for aid from the west. King Louis once again took up a cross, but his second venture, the Eighth Crusade, never reached the east. The Fifth Crusade was just one of several crusades that occurred during the Middle Ages, and despite its ultimate failure, it remained a significant historical event in the context of the Christian-Muslim conflict over control of the Holy Land.